Hey everyone, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and today I have the metalhead opportunity of a lifetime as I'm checking out one of the most famous, if not the most famous, high gain solid state amplifier in history, the Randall RG100ES. I recently held a community poll regarding the kind of amplifier and modeling content you guys would like to see going forward. And the results weren't exactly shocking. I had a pretty good feeling about them before I even posted it. And as a result, you'll be seeing a couple of those pieces of gear in order of popularity pop up on the channel within the next couple months or so. But as I was just about to pull the trigger on one of them, this pops up for a price that if I had not bought it then, I would be regretting it for the rest of my life. But it was at least significant enough to push back other content. And you know what? Executive decision made. I do not regret it at all because for all of its faults and all the things that may have not aged so well about the Randall RG100ES, it's still super interesting. And I honestly think for especially early 90s metal tones and a lot of the stuff that even people are going for today, it's just a better metal amp than a lot of tube amplifiers out there. It's sort of a one trick pony, of course, but even then, I've had a blast jamming on this thing. So I guess a bit of a disclaimer is due right up front. This is not going to be a Dimebag Daryl tone tutorial, though I do hope to get to that at some point. I have a few more pieces of gear I'd like to gather before we do that. But of course, he was one of the most prominent artists that played through this amplifier at one time. Certainly more variables to his rather unique signal chain. But, you had Death's Chuck Schuldiner play through one of these at one point, in addition to the Marshall Valve States later and some other pieces of gear. And plenty of artists have played through solid state Randalls in general. Paul Stanley had his own signature at one point. Scott Ian of Anthrax, he just sort of recently left Randall within the past few years, going to the EVH 5150. And so there's definitely a story to be told about the solid state focused era of Randall amplifiers. So what makes this one cool among all of them for me is that this is the oldest amplifier that I've ever demoed on this channel, coming from, I believe it was 1985 or 1986 that this was manufactured. And it's actually the second oldest piece of gear, period, that I've ever demonstrated, coming in only less than a decade later from my late 70s Electra 2247. So that in and of itself is pretty cool. Of course, an amplifier of this age, there's probably going to be some drawbacks and things don't work necessarily perfectly. For starters, some of these pots are a little scratchy. They have been working themselves out, which is good. So probably a couple more drops of cleaner and that will kind of work just fine. The speaker cabinet, although is a little bumped up here and there, nothing too bad. It is missing the logo, which is a bit of a bummer, but I would definitely trade that with the amplifier head. Is it still there? Probably got cracked or damaged during shipping or, playing a gig or whatever. And after a little bit of cleanup, it looks rather nice. It still smells like stale cigarettes from the prior owner. So it's not exactly pleasant to be nearby it as of right now, but it's getting better over time. And so I did kind of think about having this amplifier serviced before I made this video, but I honestly wanted to make an accurate first impressions and kind of give you guys an idea of some of the things you might expect if you're looking at a vintage amplifier like this, or especially the full package. For all of today's demonstrations, this amp will be played directly through its accompanying 4x12 cabinet. loaded with Celestion creambacks. These are the 65-watt variants. Although there was a Randall proprietary speaker around this time, and I think earlier the Jaguar, or if you're from the UK, the Jaguar, which I don't have any experience with that. But this cabinet, at least, and the speakers especially, really complement this amp. It's quite thrashy, and I've played this head through a couple of my other cabs, and I've played my other amps through this cabinet, and all the combinations sound good. So nothing to complain about there. Couple other things to keep in mind with an amplifier like this, because we've mostly covered up until this point high gain tube heads, and where this is transistor based, it's entirely solid state. It's a totally different beast than those other amplifiers. In some ways they're better, some ways they're worse, some ways are just purely different, and you can't really compare them. Especially compared to something like a Class A tube rectified amplifier, this is in a whole other universe. But even next to these Class AB diode rectified amps that I've demonstrated, whether it be the single rectifier or the gargoyle or what have you, there's still quite a noticeable difference. Not to mention the way that the tubes and the output transformer interact with the speaker cabinet. There doesn't really do the same thing here. You don't get the same sort of power amp breakup as you turn up the volume. It certainly sounds better when it's louder, even when mic'd up, and especially volume normalized. You're still getting more air, you're still getting more speaker movement, and some cool stuff happens there, but it's not the same thing. And even the preamplifier is not the same kind of distortion you get out of a high gain tube head. It's a little closer in that regard, in my opinion. But so just, you got to keep that in mind as we go forward. A lot of people would, automatically write this off because it's not tube. But there are some things that I honestly think are better for the kinds of music that this suits. Additionally, for every familiar control you find on this amp, there's bound to be an oddball or two. Fortunately, there is a regular serial effects loop around back that I'm not using in this video. But if you boost the high gain channel as much as I will be in this video, you'll probably want to stick a noise gate in there, because this amp definitely gets on the noisier side. Around front, though, is where things start to get kind of weird. I'm not sure why there's a dual on-off switch. I never have figured this one out. Documentation for this amp isn't all that great. A little loose there. Probably lost the original nut, but works in both positions. It's whatever. Maybe someone could tell me down below. That'd be great. There is a built-in reverb tank, which drove me nuts on the several-hour drive home after picking this amplifier up. No matter which way I set it, there was always springs bouncing. And yeah, it ain't a great one. Certainly not the best reverb I've ever heard on an amplifier. I'm picky about spring reverb anyway. There's a few tones like it has to have that. But even on the cleans, there is just this noisy element. And I don't mean like background static noise. It's like an impulse noise. It literally sounds like springs clanging against metal. It's not musical and it's not great. You'll hear it in a couple of the clean demonstrations. Moving on from that is a relatively innocent looking tone stack setup with an additional presence control, which, with the way this amp works, I kind of use this more as an overall hi-fi treble setting than I would most presence controls. I usually treat presence as a scalpel. Here it's like a machete, because treble affects a frequency that's kind of really high mid, sort of vocal sounding in comparison to most high gain amplifiers, especially of the tube variety. Similarly, the mids control, it can sound fine turned all the way up, and it especially sounds fine turned all the way down, depending on how you have everything dialed in. So it's kind of a decent frequency to pick, and it's sort of wide band sounding to my ears. Bass is probably the least sensitive out of all of them, where 0 to 5 is a huge difference. I mean, 0 is basically nothing, as you'd expect. 5 is quite bass heavy, but 5 to 10 isn't that much more. So the tapering kind of sucks on this one, and it gets extremely bass heavy after that noon setting as well. One neat trick you can do here is pull the treble control to engage what sounds like a bit of a gain boost at the cost of significantly lower output volume. And I wouldn't necessarily call it as much of a gain boost per se as I would like a post preamp distortion feature. It kind of sounds like the same thing a lot of modded plexis do, including my own gargoyle, where they'll engage some Zener clipping diodes at the end of the signal chain. And because they're clipping your signal, it's distorting it more, but it's also lowering the volume, just what clipping does. So I have a feeling that's kind of what's going on here. And for bedroom tones and even for some of the recorded stuff, managed to make here, it sounds pretty cool. And it can, kind of push this amp into overdrive territory where you don't necessarily have to have a pedal if your, pickups are voiced to kind of play nicely with it. But for most applications, I imagine for those that are trying to get the most out of this amp, you'll probably prefer to keep this pushed in, crank the volume, and let the pedal and the natural gain of this amp do its work. Now, before we go into tonal specifics, there's another weird thing about this amp, in that you have two channels, but you can actually play them at the same time. In a manner sort of akin to a classic Marshall Plexi, you can actually dial in the individual gain and even master volume controls for even more usability to get something between both of them. If you want to have kind of a distorted decay on your really clean pick attack, or you just want to emphasize more of the clean pick attack on a otherwise high gain signal, you could do that. Though I don't find this to be particularly useful. I think most of the usable sounds are just going to be on one channel or the other, and you dial back the gain to taste. But it's an interesting concept, and if you've got to share the EQ controls anyway, then hey, why not? The way you're probably supposed to use this, rather than being stuck on both channels being active at all times, is to use this really weird 6-prong foot switch that's basically impossible to find anymore. And of course, this one did not have it. I'm sure it was broken or lost a long time ago. There are reproductions out there. And from there, you can choose either, channel 1, channel 2, or to mix the two of them. So instead, I've got to, kind of mix them by hand like a pleb. And that's why I could never play this amp in real time if I wanted anything but a distorted sound. But for me, it works. Finally, this amp features a split input section with a regular low input and an additional 6 decibel boost on the high input, which is definitely not life-changing. 6 dB most of the time is not going to be the difference between kind of a meh amp to fire-breathing monster. It's definitely not here, but it helps to balance out, say a vintage lower output pickup system with something that's active or just simply higher output. Almost always in these demos, I'm probably using the high input because it really doesn't change much on the clean channel either, but it definitely helps to get it to crunchier territory. So before we go over the channels individually, here's sort of the way you can expect this amplifier to operate and a little snippet of the tones you can get by dialing in both at the same time. But like I said, I don't find that to be particularly useful in this amp. The Dimebag and 90s death metal fanatics watching this video aren't going to give a rat's ass about channel 1, and frankly, really none of us should because it's not great. There have been plenty of great solid state amplifier clean sounds that I love or even prefer in some instances to a tube amp for certain genres. This is not one of them. It's super flat and not even in like an overly compressed squash way. It's almost like it's not doing enough to the signal. It almost sounds like too much of a raw guitar DI. So I've never really been impressed with that sound. And again, once you try to turn up the reverb circuit, it's just kind of clangy and not extremely musical. You definitely get a little bit of bite once you start to turn up the gain on this channel. It's not that dynamic, edge of breakup kind of tone. You definitely get more distortion as you pick harder compared to a lighter touch. It is dynamic in that sense, but it doesn't feel as reactive. Doesn't feel like you're on this teeter totter to being clean to, oh, hit you in the face with a little bit of distortion. It just doesn't do that. And it's kind of flubby when you are in that territory. Turning up the gain and boosting it, you can definitely get some useful sounds. But for me, I don't think there's really a whole lot to write home about on channel one. It exists. That's about all I can say. Channel two is where the interesting conversation begins for me. And I'll be honest, I think if someone took this preamp circuit and repackaged it as a new product, whether it be a pedal or new amp or whatever, most people probably wouldn't be that impressed with it. We have so many just chug monsters out there, so many plug and play pieces of equipment that I think we're spoiled to not having to do much of anything to our guitar tone. We go throw a tube screamer in front. Woohoo. So many amps nowadays don't even need that. And this is not that kind of amplifier. It's extremely bass heavy in its natural form, both in terms of the tone stack and as well as the gain structure. It does not filter a whole lot of that. So that means there's only a few tones that I think really excel when you plug in a guitar straight into this thing and go from there, especially if you have a higher output guitar. But honestly, I think it does a better mid gain classic rock thing where most people would think, oh, this, that's impossible. This amp couldn't do that. Well, in my opinion, it does classic AC/DC fine. It doesn't sound, as good as a crank plexi. It does a lot of that kind of 80s hairband stuff really well too. It's not exactly the same, but I honestly think this is more what that circuit was designed to do. And so it's not just dime bag in a box, whereas I think a lot of people have that misconception. He was boosting this thing with like 30 dB of gain and then chopping off a whole lot of low end, not as much as we might do today, but still pushing this thing into insane levels where he probably could have used any other amp and got a similar result. And so I guess that's what makes this cool is that, yeah, it is not like this legendary guitar tone just when you plug straight into it. And very few amplifiers are, to be fair, even some of my favorite tube amps. But it is at least good enough that it reacts as a platform amp in a way that I honestly think is just as good as so many metal tones that are out there today. Especially for like 90s kind of material. It is a faster feeling amplifier. Every note jumps out at you at what feels like was the intended level of aggression of output volume. There isn't that level of, I guess you could call it, elasticity associated with tube amplifiers. And it's ultimately going to come down to the guitar player. A blues player is likely going to hate this amp. But for a lot of metal stuff, especially at the time this amp was released, it's perfect. Like it's more well suited to that than I think a lot of modern tube amplifiers are. No, this thing is not a plug and play device. And Sure, EVH 5153 with it's 1,000 tubes and all that is a great sound, but I miss this kind of sound in modern recordings. It is so no nonsense. It is so imperfect that it adds just this level of instantaneous connection with the guitar sound in a way that I have a real hard time forming into words. But there's a sound here that is different. And that for me is enough to be excited about it. So, yeah, of course, most of my favorite tones are going to involve pushing this thing with external gear. But when you do, and I'm going to probably do that for a lot of my amps anyway, it's pretty damn cool. In conclusion, then, the classic RG100 amps aren't exactly products I can recommend to everyone, even if I could. Good luck finding them. They do pop up from time to time on the used markets, but the going prices are rather sporadic, anywhere from 400 all the way up to a grand, depending on if you're buying a new, basically taken right out of the box, not touched for 30 years model, or the kind of stained, couple knobs missing carpeted version, which honestly I kind of wanted one of those just because they look so ridiculous. But given just how incapable this amp is versus a lot of modern stuff out there, it's not going to be a logical investment for most people. And for me, this amp doesn't exactly make it even into my top 10 most desired amps ever, but it's a piece of history, and it does sound different and it sounds cool, and it's something that I will continue to use. I have lost myself playing through this amp, researching for this video or getting prepared for making it or whatever, trying to find cool sweet spot sounds and forgetting about that entirely and just playing for half an hour. And that's a sign of a good amp. It's a sign of a good piece of gear in general. And Yeah, I mean, I'm not getting all my tones out of this thing, but crank some Pantera, some Death, some hell, Corrosion of Conformity was sounding good through this thing. Then you're bound to have a smile put on your face. This amp will certainly show up in more content over the next couple of months, so keep an eye out for that. In the meantime, thank you so very much for watching. Any other questions or comments, please leave them down below, and we'll see you next time. Bye.